You know what drives me nuts? Getting FM'd. It happens to everybody eventually. Fluke results and ridiculous goals are just part of reality. And it happens in real life, too. Well, we're going to talk today about the most infamous upset in World Cup history. Well, you probably already know this story. The United States, a country that barely knew the first thing about association football, pulled off a miraculous 1-0 upset against England in the 1950 World Cup. Memories of this famous upset come up every time the two nations meet. But there's a lot more to this story than just that game in Brazil. So I took some time to dig into the newspaper archives to see what I could find. And on one hand, I think it was a bigger shock than we give it credit for. On the other hand, I do think that we need to understand a couple things about what the sport was like in the United States. Alright, let's start from the most important part. There actually was professional soccer in the United States in 1950. The American Soccer League, for example, was a small regional league made up of mostly ethnic teams. But it did exist, and it was a professional league. So, in other words, it's not entirely accurate to claim that the American players were just a bunch of amateurs, but they also were not exactly salaried professionals. It's kind of complicated. Take Joe Geachens, the man who scored that goal for the United States, for example. He played for Brookhaven in the American Soccer League. Geachens made about $25 per game. Now, that's not much when you consider that ASL teams played only around 16 games per season. But it's also far from the claim that the Americans were complete amateurs. I went through the 11 players that the United States put out in that game and noticed that every single one of them played for professional or at least major clubs in the United States. 3 of the players were in the American Soccer League, 4 of them played for semi-pro clubs in St. Louis, then the other 2 played for an amateur team in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is basically the spiritual home of association football in the United States. Now, the teams from St. Louis and Fall River played in their own small regional leagues. While I could find some contemporary news coverage of their cup matches, finding league information has been extremely difficult. The American Soccer League, meanwhile, really was a regional league. It received very little coverage outside the New York City and Philadelphia area. The United States national team players chiefly came from Simpkins Ford of St. Louis, Ponta Delgada of Fall River, and the Philadelphia Nationals of the ASL. Philadelphia had won the ASL that year, and Simpkins and Ponta Delgada were the finalists in the annual National Challenge Cup. Simpkins Ford, by the way, was named after a Ford car dealership in St. Louis that sponsored the team. It was owned by a man whose surname was Simpkins. Now, the other thing that you've got to realize is that the Americans had played against European competition before. In fact, Manchester United, who had finished 4th in the First Division, toured the United States in May that year. That's right, and I didn't know this until I discovered it all by accident. The Manchester United game in St. Louis on May 25th received a lot of local attention. Now, that was a little over a month before the famous meeting in Brazil. In fact, St. Louis had frequently hosted international football clubs for friendlies, though the St. Louis teams almost always lost. That game was played at the old public school stadium in St. Louis. "7,000 people turned up to see Manchester United win by a convincing 5-0 margin. Now, it gets really complicated from here, and I'm not certain that I fully understand this. There was apparently also a separate England team that toured the United States and Canada in early June 1950. Stanley Matthews led them to a slim 3-2 victory over an all-star team in Victoria, British Columbia, up in Canada. And it seemed that this version of the England team played against the United States World Cup squad right before the United States team went to Brazil. England won that game in New York City, 1-0. Now, that game in New York was attended by over 8,000 people. However, the only write-up I could find anywhere in the American press was that small Associated Press paragraph that I just showed you. That was after searching through hundreds of newspapers. Now, this is the part that I really don't understand. I mean, there clearly was demand for soccer in the United States at that time. There were Major League Baseball teams in 1950 that would struggle to draw 8,000 people for a single game. So why didn't anybody think this sport was worth covering? In fact, coverage of the 1950 World Cup barely existed in the US papers. There were a few token articles here and there about qualifying, though all of them came from generic Associated Press reports. Famously, the only American paper with an actual reporter in Brazil in 1950 was the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Dent McSkimming went there, but he was there on his own dime. In fact, he had to take vacation time to attend. He also had to pay for his own costs since his editors found the event not newsworthy. Alright, so what about the game itself? Well, it went just about as you'd expect. England dominated possession and peppered shots at the Americans, but all to no avail. Geachens scored his goal in the first half. He was aided by a deflection. Charlie Colombo made a famous tackle to prevent an England breakaway. Those who have described it make it sound more like an American football tackle than a proper tackle. England did have a late penalty, but keeper Frank Borghi made the save, and there was your fluke victory. Now, the other thing to note is that this actually had absolutely no impact at all on the development of soccer in the United States. This article, a short and rude piece mocking English reporters, was really the only thing reported about the match in most American newspapers. Interestingly enough, coverage in the British press was also sparse. I did find this article speculating that American teams might try to import more European players as a result, but none of that happened. Now, there's some irony here. The ironic thing is that it wasn't until England won the World Cup in 1966 that big money started to take soccer in the United States seriously. That's the ironic part. When England won, then we started to care. The black and white BBC footage of that England-West Germany final in 1966 was shown on NBC on a same-day tape delay. It apparently had a pretty strong audience, which is why the money got interested. It was that audience that led to the formation of the NASL, not the shock US victory in 1950. In other words, though 1950 might be a bragging point for American soccer fans, the truth is that it's more an accident of history than anything else. So was this a major upset? Yes. But the sad part is that it really didn't do anything to develop the sport in the United States.